Good afternoon. Thank you all very much for coming. It's my great pleasure to welcome the artist David Batchelor to Leeds Beckett University. Not only is David Batchelor recognised as a highly successful international artist, he is also renowned for his critical writing. He is the author of Minimalism, Tate Publications 97, the author of Chromophobia, Reaction Books 2000, and the editor of the anthology on colour for the highly regarded Documents of Contemporary Art series, MIT Press, Whitechapel Gallery 2008. He is regularly invited to give guest lectures and has been invited to talk at Tate Modern. 3 days ago, when I was putting up the posters to advertise David's talk, a student called Michael, who's in the audience today, asked me if they could have one for their personal archive, going on to say, David Batchelor's book on the fear of colour, Chromophobia, literally saved my dissertation. I enjoyed the way the student used the past tense of this verb, as if David's book was some form of life preserver, buoyancy aid. I do believe Michael has brought his book along in the hope of a signature at the end. We are delighted that David has taken time out of his very busy schedule to come and talk to us about his work for the prestigious Inside Out lecture series. Please join me in giving a very warm Yorkshire welcome to David Batchelor.
Thank you, Simon, very much for the introduction and the invitation to talk here. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. If I know that I've saved someone's dissertation, then I guess my life has been worthwhile. I'm going to talk both about the work, mainly three-dimensional work I make in the studio, and about the writing on colour that I've done over the last years. And I'll try to sort of weave them together more or less seamlessly. This is, on screen is a work called A Magic Hour, which I made originally in 2004, and then altered it in 2007, and then altered it again in 2013 when it was exhibited at the Hayward Gallery's exhibition Light Show, which has subsequently been touring. And I start with this because it's a key work for me in several respects, and I'll try to explain why that is as I go through. It's, just for information, it's made from 30 odd found industrial light boxes, the smaller exit signs and restaurant signs and such like, on a sense of found steel. How do? Says it all, really. On, where was I? Found steel uprights, and then the boxes are relit, and the colour I have acrylic sheet, and the colour then is bled against it. The work stands about a foot away from the wall, and the colour spills onto the wall. I will come back to that work in due course. So that's approximately what I was working on in the first years of the 2000s. This is some work I was making in about 1990, and I show it only to indicate that I wasn't always working with colour. In fact, when I went to art college and afterwards, no one worked with colour. Certainly not me. Certainly not anyone who taught me or anyone who was around. I went to art college during the sort of heyday of conceptual art, and conceptual art was treated colour like Superman treated kryptonite. It was a no-go area. And I followed suit and didn't even think about colour from when I went to art college for probably the best part of 20 years. I'm not going to burden you with the details about these. They're basically shaped picture frames. There was a reason for it, but it wasn't very good. This was the first time I showed work in a commercial gallery in London. It was a summer group show, sort of testing the water with a bunch of young artists, and I made three-dimensional versions of these hanging frame things with the idea that this was a gallery in central London where obviously has a big picture window onto the street, but the entrance to the gallery is sort of up the side, and you come in at the back of the gallery. And I wanted to exploit that. So my great idea, unfortunately I didn't tell the gallery this at the time. My idea was to have 3 8-foot high, 4-foot wide, freestanding, frame-like things in the window. The gallery were expecting 2 60-centimetre high little things that would hang on the wall. And when I arrived, they were not overly impressed or delighted. And they wouldn't let me show all 3. I was going to call it the 3 Graces, to give it a kind of classical title. So it ended up as the 2 Graces, which is not, again, not ideal. But the aim was that when you went into the gallery, from the front you'd sort of see the work in all its glory, but from the back it was just a sort of stage prop idea. And this was my first ever sculpture, and I wanted to make a sculpture that was not in the round, which was not like a Henry Moore, but was somehow flatter and more like a billboard than a sculpture, more like a thing with a face and a support. And that struck me. What I was thinking, I think, about was that it was more like the experience of the city. The city is a place of facades and billboards and structures that support them. Then it's not in nature is in the round, trees, mountains. The city is a series of faces and facades. I thought it was a good idea at the time. It wasn't. I mean, the show was a disaster for me. The gallery never spoke to me again. It cost me more money than I had to make them at the time, and I only got to show 2 of the 3. 3 months later, they were back in my studio gathering dust, and my future seemed as bleak as it had before the exhibition. But there was something about, I mean, the work was wrong. It was the wrong work for the wrong place at the wrong time. Nevertheless, there was something that was still bugging me, and it was really to do with this front and back thing. And I thought I could do the front and back thing better in sculpture than I had done to that point. And I made a small work when I got back to the studio. It's only about that high, like at 25 centimetres high. And in order to emphasize the difference between the front and the back, I painted the front a bit pink. And the only reason for telling you that is that that's the first time I ever used colour. But I didn't use it because I was interested in colour. I used it because I wanted to make a difference between the front and the back of the work. So this is what you saw from the front, and from the back is just this little found object support. This little thing cost nothing to make, and it took about half a day. Whereas the 3 Graces had taken me several months to make and a significant amount of money. And what was quite clear was that this little thing was much better than the big things, even though it had taken no time and effort to do. But it strikes me that that's what art is like. Working hard doesn't make it better. Taking a long time and spending a lot of money doesn't make it better necessarily than something you improvise one evening. The minute I used some colour, the minute I stuck the pink on the front of a pink plexiglass on the front of this work, it kind of struck me that there wasn't much colour around in contemporary art or in the environment that I kind of tended to inhabit at the time. And it simply made me wonder why that was. This is 92 at the time. YBA is sort of on the march, all around London at least. After the exhibition that I was in, as ever, there was a kind of after party at the gallerist's house. And this house, which is a rather grand building in North London, a Victorian red brick building in North London, from the outside. As you went in the house, every single bit of decoration, colour, information or ornate element had been stripped away. The whole thing was completely ripped out and clinical kind of environment. Most particularly, all the walls and the floors and the ceiling were white. Even the windows had frosted glass in front of them, so you couldn't really get anything from the outside. All the furniture was black leather Le Corbusier chairs and such. And every single work of art was grey. And it really gave me the creeps. And it also made me think that the work I was making at the time would fit in that environment quite well. And that gave me the creeps. And between these different events and thoughts, it made me think that, well, it made me ask a question like, well, what's wrong with colour? When you go into this very elegant, very cultivated environment and they completely erase colour from your experience, what's at stake there? Why is that happening? Why do people like to get rid of colour in order to live a certain kind of life? And that question kind of motivated me ever since. And it made me think, well, first of all, I want to make I'm going to use colour in the studio because no one seems to be doing much of it at the time. And actually, probably people were, I just wasn't aware of it. And I want to make work that is emphatically about colour. Not just sort of colourful things, but work whose subject is its colour. And I want to get my revenge on these kind of white environments and that gallery and so forth. And so from the early 90s, I began tentatively to start working with colour. In particular, I wanted to work with the colours of the city, urban colours. I mean, I've lived in cities all my life. I love cities. They're a great resource, a sort of inspiration in many ways. Not always in London. I lived in Birmingham and Nottingham and then London. And when I travel, I always find that you can go from one big city to another big city and they've got something in common, and they also provide you with ideas and inspiration and so forth. So I wanted to use colour that was not natural but more urban, not the colours of nature but the colours of the city. And I wanted to find ways of presenting them that was somehow adequate to that. And that took me a long time. The first, I'm going to jump around a bit. I mean, this is one of the first works I made that I felt sort of okay about. It's sheets of plastic, of cast acrylic, like perspex or plexiglass, painted on the back with enamel paint. And that makes the colour go very flat, very shiny, and very kind of industrial looking. You don't get any brush marks or any indication of how it was made. It makes the colours look like paint when you open the tin. The American artist Frank Stella said, I wanted the paint to look as good as it was in the tin. And he's talking about tins of paint, not tubes of paint. And you know that thing when you open a tin of paint and you've got that gorgeous liquid colour. And whenever you apply it to a surface, it's less good than when it was in the tin. And I think that idea of trying to preserve that quality of first opening the tin, I can entirely understand what Stella was saying, and something I've always wanted to try to do myself. So these are just actually offcuts of plexiglass. I was making some more elaborate works, and I found that as I was doing these offcuts and putting them to the side, they sort of looked more interesting than the thing I was making. And that led me, after a sort of certain amount of hesitation, to simply get a bunch of offcuts and stick them on a shelf. And immediately those offcuts looked better than the thing I was focusing on. I mean, a bit like, and I found that's been a very regular occurrence in the studio. Your grand ideas are often less interesting than the throwaway bits at the side. And I think it often pays to look out of the corner of your eyes in the studio and notice what's going on outside your main attention span. So this just sits on a steel shelf. I think most of my work operates between painting and sculpture, between 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions. And something sitting on a shelf like this, it's in the place of a painting, it's on the wall, but it's physical and physically sitting on something, so in a way it's 3-dimensional as well. The multicolour version of essentially the same thing. It's only about 60 centimetres wide. They're not very big. But these were the first works I did with colour that I felt there was something going on that was holding my attention, I guess. That in turn led me to do these works, which are found industrial dollies, flatbed dollies, which you use in supermarkets and so forth. And each of the dollies I used as a support device for this flat panel of colour. Again, the flat panel is clear perspex painted underneath to produce this very liquid, shiny, intense industrial, artificial kind of colour. And what I was thinking about when I was doing this, well, the first thing I was thinking about, I was invited to do an exhibition at this space, which is the Economist building in London, and I was told I couldn't use the walls. And all the shelf pieces were definitely wall-based. So I had to use the floor. I had, in the studio, the third dolly in, the red one. It was a big old thing I'd found at the back of King's Cross Station where I used to live. And I thought it would be good for moving the Three Graces around. Like every studio should have a dolly kind of for moving things around. In the end, I threw out the Three Graces and kept the dolly. And I'd painted a panel of red, of acrylic red, and I'd left it to dry on the dolly, and it sort of fitted. I hadn't planned it, but the minute I put the panel on the dolly, it seemed to me that it would work as a way of supporting the colour, as a way of being an object, but the colour being its own thing, quite independent of that object. And that led me quite quickly then to scavenge dollies from around London and paint a panel for each of them. The dolly would determine the shape of the panel, and that would then allow me to move the colours around, literally or, as it were, metaphorically. Even then I was thinking that when I was reading more about colour theory, that every colour theory tends to imply a kind of grammar of colour, do's and don'ts of colour, a hierarchy of primaries and secondaries and tertiaries. And it really struck me that the best thing about colour was that the way it exceeds those systems, that however sophisticated our language of colour is, colour itself is much richer, much stranger, and much less predictable than that. And I wanted to find a way of embodying that in the work. So I wanted to make work where the colours were almost literally mobile. They could be moved around and mixed up. It also meant that when I re-exhibited the work in another place, I could reshape it, and it looked like I'd made another work. It looked like I had more work than I'd actually made. So in different environment, I could stretch or contract the work as was required by the space. So it was around the time, this was about 95 by then, and it had dawned on me that what I was doing was, that my subject was colour in the city, pretty much. It's not a subject I'd selected for myself, but one that had sort of presented itself to me. And it made me think, well, if I'm going to look at colour in the city, then I need to look at the typical forms of colour in the city, and one of the most typical forms is illuminated colour. Light boxes, neons, billboards. I mean, and the colour technology is changing absolutely all the time. I mean, the stack of light boxes at the back were just, again, these scavenged light boxes from a salvage place in East London, which I'd relight with fluorescent lights and put a panel of coloured acrylic in front of them, some opaque, some transparent. No one uses fluorescent lights anymore, and this was, around 2000. It's all gone over to LEDs now. So colour technology is constantly changing. And when I started acquiring these light boxes, I tried to find ways of presenting them, and I put them on wheels, and that didn't work, and I hung them on the wall, and that didn't look very interesting, and eventually I ended up just stacking them on shelving units in this sort of linear way. And the dollies at the front are basically the same group as in the previous slide, but again rearranged in a more kind of random way. Around this time, I was also I'd been reading about colour theory, different versions of what the significance of colour was. I was trying to answer this question, well, what's wrong with colour, that seemed to be the case in the art world in particular at the time. And I was invited to, actually, the first ever solo show was at the Henry Moore Institute around the corner, when it was directed by Penelope Curtis in 1996, I think. And it was in that little bridge gallery. It was a very small show. And the director had asked me to, in the main gallery there was some 19th century polychrome sculpture, so we say, 19th century painted sculpture. And the director asked if I'd write a short text about colour and sculpture to fit for a pamphlet that would go with my show and with the show of 19th century work. And so I began to write about what I perceived to be this kind of prejudice in the West about colour. It was only a short essay, about 1,000 words. And as I was writing it, I was trying to think of a term to describe what I felt was this resistance to colour in the West. And I remember writing, it's almost like there's a kind of phobia of colour, a phobia of the chromatic. And I came up with this word, chromophobia, which I thought was encapsulated what I was trying to say. So I titled this essay Chromophobia. And what I meant by that, specifically, was that, and the more I read around colour, the more I read philosophy of colour and art, historians writing about colour and colour theorists of one kind or another, from the West, was that there's a sense that colour is less important than other elements of art, that it's somehow marginalised as being supplementary or minor or inessential or cosmetic. And that in the academic training, if you'd gone to art school in the 18th or 19th century, you would have been taught that drawing was the most important element of art, and that colour was the secondary or tertiary phase of art. It was just colouring in. But all the ambition of art, all the abstraction, all the intellectual effort of art is in drawing, and colour is just colouring in. It's minor, dispensable, and has no intellectual content. And that's the phrase is called disegno versus colore, drawing versus colour. And that prejudice, that sense that colour is minor and incidental and trivial, I think persists through the Western canon. And it's evident in conceptual art. It's evident in architectural theory from the 1920s onwards. It's evident in an awful lot of stuff. And specifically, I found that so much writing on colour tended to say that the way it marginalised by colour was, there were two ways. One was saying that colour it's not intellectual, it's not complex. On the contrary, they say it's sort of other to the higher workings of the mind. And in particular, they would say that colour is feminine as opposed to masculine, and you still find that. It is said that colour is oriental as opposed to occidental, or eastern as opposed to western, that it's primitive rather than sophisticated, that it's infantile rather than adult, or that it's kitsch rather than sophisticated. So colour's constantly kind of treated as feminine, eastern, primitive, infantile, or kitsch, which is incredibly aggressive about something that we all experience all the time, and doesn't appear to do us any harm. Here's one brief quotation to give exemplify that tendency to treat colour as other. It's written by a 19th century French theorist of colour, art theorist called Charles White, as it happens. And he says, this is written in 1851, and he's talking about this disegno versus colore, this design or drawing in relationship to colour. And he says, the union of design and colour is necessary to beget painting, just as is the union of man and woman to beget mankind. Otherwise, to beget mankind. But design must maintain its preponderance over colour. Otherwise, painting speeds to its ruin. It will fall through colour, just as mankind fell through Eve. I mean, you couldn't make it up. It's written in a kind of Old Testament rhetoric. Adam and Eve, the fall from grace, the biblical fall. And it's saying, well, you can't get rid of colour. It's there, it's in the world. So you have to subordinate it. And it seems to me that Charles Blanc thinks he says that's exactly the same with women. You can't get rid of them. It seems to imply that he might like to. So he feels that women simply need to be subordinated instead. This is not my idea, obviously. And it's kind of, it's an extraordinary, I mean, it seems ridiculous, but at the same time, I don't think it's an uncommon prejudice about colour, even if it's phrased in ways that we wouldn't use much these days. And there's one other way in which colour is often marginalised, and that's when it's treated as cosmetic as opposed to essential or necessary. And to say that colour is cosmetic is to say that it can be wiped away, that its relationship with the object it covers is almost arbitrary or unnecessary. And it's saying that if colour is cosmetic, then you can probably better understand the objects in the world by wiping off the colour. The truth is not in colour, and the colours are kind of deceit. Roland Barthes said about cosmetics. Roland Barthes, very interesting writer on colour and on photography and other elements. When he writes about painting, he loves colour. When he writes about photography, he hates colour. And he says colour is like in a photograph, and this is him writing, I guess, in the 1950s or early 60s. Colour in a photograph is like a cosmetic used to paint a corpse, sort of makeup for a dead body. It always feels that it's been artificially applied after the death of the work. So again, for Barthes, colour in photography seemed to be something to avoid. Anyway, so this was the basic thesis about colour that then became this short book, which saved Michael's dissertation, called Chromophobia. I thought I'd have made up the word. In fact, I hadn't. There's an animation by a Belgian filmmaker called Chromophobia that was made in 1966. I say that because in 2005, the filmmaker Martha Fiennes made a movie called Chromophobia and didn't credit me or ask me, but it's a rubbish movie. So I reviewed it, obviously. Okay, so that reading and thinking about colour was sort of ongoing, and it is still ongoing. Colour is an extraordinarily complex subject, and I think, well, of course, the question is why do so many writers, why do people like Charles Blanc so aggressively try to trivialise or marginalise colour? I mean, I think there's all sorts of ways of answering that. I think one is that the feeling that colour is too closely associated with the body, with appetites, with the senses, and therefore has an awkward relationship with the intellect, with the mind. More particularly, I think, colour is an embarrassment to language. We are profoundly language-using beings. In a way, we couldn't, well, I mean, it's, I guess, self-evident. And we depend on language in so many ways and so much of the time, to the extent that we sometimes forget that there are experiences which are outside language, things we can't put into words. And I think one of those things is colour. And there's a simple way of illustrating that, which is to say that apparently the average human eye can detect about 10 or 11 million different gradations of colour. That's a normal part of the sort of sense perception, visual systems of humans. It's not as good as, it's better than some animals. We have a trichromatic system. We have 3 colour receptors which enable us to generate the sort of millions of colours that we can see. Some animals only have 2 colour receptors, which means a much, much reduced colour range, almost none at all. And some animals, in particular a prawn that lives in the Great Barrier Reef off northern Australia, has between 12 and 16 colour receptors, which means they can see colours. Not only can they see colours that we can't see, they can see colours we can't even imagine seeing. And that's prawns for you. So we can see, the average human eye can distinguish between about 10 to 11 million different gradations of colour. Most languages have only up to 11 basic colour terms. So there's a huge asymmetry between what we can see out there and what we can say. Now, of course, we have many more colour terms, but the notion of a basic colour term comes from anthropology, and it's the idea that it's the vocabulary you would expect every user, every adult user of that language to be familiar with. English has 11 basic colour terms, but of course, specialists such as yourselves use many other colour terms as well. But the 11 basic colour terms in English are red, yellow, blue, green, orange, purple, black, white, grey, pink, and brown. That's it. So when someone says, "What's your favourite colour?" Which is almost always a question I get asked at the end of a lecture. Now I've ruined it. When someone says, "What's your favourite colour?" Well, if you answer red, you're effectively saying, "I've got about 1 million favourite colours." Consequently, it's not... Anyway. So I think that one of the things that really fascinates me about colour is its highly awkward relationship with language. This is the biggest of the towers that I did. This is in Sao Paulo in Brazil, and it's in the best art building in the world, for my money, and it's the Sao Paulo Bienal building, designed by Oscar Niemeyer, the great Brazilian architect, in a series of swooping curvilinear platforms and staircases and ramps. It's about 18 meters, I think, from top to bottom, and it was, for me, literally the best place in the world I could imagine being able to show something. This was in a Sao Paulo Bienal in 2003, and I knew it to some extent then, but less so than I do now, that Brazil has an extraordinarily vivid modern art, from the whole of the 20th century, but particularly art in the 50s and 60s and beyond. There's a superb range of Latin American artists more generally, but particularly Brazilian artists, working on the city, abstraction, and in some cases colour. And I think that's one of the reasons why my work sort of went okay there. There's more of an overlap with what I'm doing with that body of thinking than probably many other places. And I always like to show how it works. So I always keep the cable and the plugs and the plug sockets for the work. It's always part of the work. Some artists who use light use it to evoke a sort of some kind of spiritual experience. If you show the plugs and the cable, it tends to prevent that sort of phony religious experience that you can get when you use with colour. So I always show the plugs and the cables and the back of the work, if you like. This is another group of light boxes from around the same time, in a more asymmetric, if you like, arrangement. Again, on a series of found office bookshelves. One of the great things about working with illuminated colour is that, is the reflections. The reflections are the one thing you can't predict or control, and they're the one moment in which colour escapes its container. In a way, the colour is sort of set free when it bounces off a wall and off a window or any reflective surface. And that, for me, is almost the great moment and the real delight of colour, is that you can't predict or anticipate how it's going to behave in any particular environment. More recently, I found a wonderful quotation by Walter Benjamin, the great German writer from the first half of the 20th century. And Benjamin was a great writer about the city. He loved the writings of Baudelaire, and he wrote about Paris and shopping, or the shops, the arcades of Paris, and he wrote a long, very strange essay in the 1920s called One-Way Street. And it's a very strange and fractured essay, and I couldn't, in some respects, say what it's about. But there's one moment in the essay. he says something I think absolutely remarkable, and it's just 2 sentences. And he says, what in the end makes advertisements so superior to criticism? And I think by criticism he means the work he does, philosophy, analysis, literary analysis. So what in the end makes advertisements so superior to criticism? And he answers, it's not what the moving red neon sign says, it's the fiery pool reflecting in the asphalt. And I think that idea of the fiery pool reflecting in the asphalt, which is in a puddle on a dark road, is a perfect illustration of what colour does in the city. And that colour in the city, as opposed to the colours in nature, requires darkness. The best colours in nature, in a way, are in daylight, obviously, the birds and the flowers and so forth. The most vivid colours come in a vividly lit environment. In the city, it's the opposite. The best colours come out at night or at dusk, because self-illuminated objects require that framing of darkness. And Benjamin's staring down at a puddle on the city street against the black asphalt is in a way the perfect description of colour in the city for me. And it's reflections which generate that. This is one of my favourite images. When I was on that first trip to Brazil, to Sao Paulo for this Biennale, I came across a Brazilian roadworks. And at the time, less so now, when they had roadworks and they put up warning signs, whereas we have our kite-marked EU standard road signage with the images, in Brazil they get a bucket and they stick a light inside it. And that's all it is. And it's a rather beautiful sculptural thing in itself. And then, of course, it glows brilliantly at night. And it's things like that, those sort of incidental moments in the city street, which for me are the kind of inspiration for the work I do. And I photographed this in my first digital camera back in the day, and I just thought, oh yeah, plastic objects and lights, that's an idea. And gradually that led me, which I think it must have been, gradually that led me to start experimenting with getting ordinary plastic objects from supermarkets, detergent bottles, shampoo bottles, and then sort of kebabbing them on a fluorescent light. And they glow with extraordinary vivid colour. And these ones just lean in connect. I call them idiot sticks. I'm never quite sure why, but it seemed like the right term for them. So they sort of kebabbed bottles on a fluorescent light. And then that in turn led me to make this one, which is about 300 bottles on a festoon arrangement and they all have low energy lights inside each bottle. In this case, there's just wrapped around a pillar in the South Bank Centre in London. This was in 2006. If you're working with colour in the city, then as I said, illuminated colour is a very powerful part of that experience. And I got really hooked on illuminated colour for some years. But there are all sorts of different forms of illuminated colour and of other colour. And one form I became interested in was colour that it's glowing and illuminated, but you don't see the source of the light. The colour is thrown against a surface and bounces back. It's in a way where the colour isn't contained by the object, but spills beyond it, beyond its framing edge. And so these dollies are like, in a way, the negative of the ones I'd made before. Whereas the ones I made before had a sort of dark frame which contained a very vivid panel of colour. These have these sort of dark panels which are framed by sort of glowing light. And it's just fluorescent lights with filters on underneath. And they're sort of, in my mind, they connected very directly with those pimped up cars that people used to drive around but don't seem to much anymore. And I like that kind of street culture and that not high-end use of colour in the city. this work was, again light boxes, that I was invited to do a show in a gallery which has 2 rooms joined by this double doorway. And I wanted to make a work which was a kind of like a barrier, which prevented you going from one room to the next. So I decided to put these light boxes in the middle of the room, in the doorway, so that from one side you got all the glowing coloured light, and then from the other side you just got this kind of the back of the stereo, as it were, and which I was fine about, except for I really didn't like the front of the work. It felt too composed, too ordered, too orderly, too neat in a way. And when I made another version of this, and I showed it in another venue, when I got the work back again, I decided I wanted to do something about it, so I wasn't annoyed by the front so much. And that's what led to this, which was to make the work. And so originally this work sat in a gallery in a aperture between 2 galleries, so you got the back from one side and the front from the other. And when I got it back to the studio, it was originally made in 2004. When I got it back to the studio, eventually I turned it against the wall, and it generated this glowing kind of halo effect. And the minute I did that, I realized that was what the work needed to be. But again, as I've said before, I didn't make this work with that idea in mind. It ended up like this because I was pissed off with the way it looked, having spent some time working on it. So I think often again, a work instructs you as how it should be finished or how it should be made, rather than you instructing it. And this is called magic hour, as I said, because it refers to that moment particularly in places like Las Vegas, the magic hour is dusk, when all the illuminations come on, when all the lights and the neon start glowing, and when people start spending their money, essentially. Las Vegas in the daytime is really bleak. It only works at night, and then it literally comes alive. In the daytime, it's just a shabby city in the middle of a desert. So again, that's that relationship between the city and colour and darkness. This is another version of the same works in a concrete gallery back in Brazil. In this case, single colour. Again, they're all the same. The white puncture holes at the back of the light boxes are just the screw holes where they would have originally been fixed to the wall. So again, they're not designed. They're just part of the objects. This was a similar version for a commission for Gloucester Road Underground Station in London, where they have a disused platform, where they have these wonderful, there's actually 20 of these Victorian niches. And I decided to suspend a panel inside each of the niches where the colour would be thrown out at the back, but also contained by the niche. And most of the materials come from the waste store of London Underground. So the third one in, those 3 round elements, are 3 London Underground roundels joined together to make that sort of shape. And I got very preoccupied with this silhouetting device. And it was only much more recently, when I read the Walter Benjamin, that I really began to understand what it was about that relationship between colour and darkness that was interesting me. And it's that is that characteristic of colour in the city. This is a pimped up concrete mixer. I was asked by the Hayward Gallery to do their Christmas lights one year. This was the same year as I did those lights wrapped around the pillar. At the time, the Royal Festival Hall in London was being refurbished, so it was a building site. And like everywhere, every city, there's always building sites, and they're always a bit of an interruption, and you have to manoeuvre around them, and they have fencing. And I thought, rather than illuminate the building, I would illuminate the building site, and then stick the works back on the building site. In a way, simply as a way of drawing attention to there's more interesting things on a building site usually than on a building. So I got the concrete mixer. I got a couple of concrete mixers and some old drums and things, and illuminated them and then stuck them back on the building site in the winter of 2006. This was one of the other works. Again, it's a wheelie bin sort of stuffed full of lights of one kind or another. And I think there's something about that relationship between colour in the city and dirt, as well as darkness or rubbish, that sort of works for me. And these are some neon outlined pipes and conduit that comes from a scrapyard. Again, these were made in Brazil. And again, it's about that relationship between the intense colour and that sort of intrinsically dirty and dark materiality, and the found shapes. And then the illuminated skip. Skips are everywhere. Every city that's on the up or on the down, which is say every city, has its quantity of skips, which just generally just get in the way. But again, I actually think these skips. This is in Sao Paulo. This is the gallery, a concrete gallery that I work with. Skips are kind of, without sounding stupid, they're sculpturally interesting things. They're good shapes, good volumes, good forms. And so this was just a way of getting a rusty old skip and then depositing. I wanted to put it back in the street, of course, but this is actually, of course, outside the gallery now, or then. I was in an exhibition, I don't know, in 2007 or 8, and it was called an exhibition of light art, and I hate the term light art, and it made me realise that most of what I've been making for some years was illuminated, and I wanted to get off illumination, not forever, but just to see whether I could. And I got increasingly interested more recently in transparent colour with either artificial light or natural light shining through it. So I've used solid colour in those dollies, and I've used glowing colour and projected colour. I became interested in using colour and transparency. And this was a commission for St Pancras Station in London. And it was where the Olympic rings had hung in 2012, and the people who own the station realised that there's this great space for doing things. And they invited me to make a proposal for a work to do there. And I thought, well, St Pancras was the largest arched span in the world when it was designed in 1866 or 67. And at the time, those great, the engineering involved in the steel and ironwork and the glass, and the whole infrastructure of railways was part of that, celebration of the first phase of industrialization. And they are, people have called them like cathedrals of industrialization. I thought, well, maybe what I could make is a kind of stained glass window for a railway station. And the shapes eventually, I spent a lot of time looking at the structure of the station and the ironwork and the steelwork. And eventually these shapes kind of vaguely came out of that. And then, and I put these panels of colour in. Now, what I forgot to bring was a slide where the colour sort of spills onto the Eurostar platform in this kind of, at certain times of day. But transparent colour has become very interesting to me, and the materials that you can use for using that, which is essentially plexiglass and glass. This is it on the ground, or as it's been hoisted. It's absolutely, it's big, it's 20 metres across. But then when you get something that big, up into that volume, it's a 100-metre span. Something 20 metres across is big when it's on the ground. It becomes quite small when it's up there. And this is one of my sort of favourite photos, again, a kind of reflection motif running through it. But most of the work I make in the studio. And I like working in the studio. I like building things and making the mistakes, and those mistakes generating a sense of what to do next. Sometimes when you're doing the big stuff, it has to be engineered, and I have to make it, get other people to make it. so there's a kind of leap of faith between the drawing and the work. And I generally don't make drawings for, I make drawings, but I don't make them for then being scaled up. It's something I've always tried to avoid. However, in that kind of environment, that's the only way you can work. And there's a strange kind of leap of faith between a drawing on a bit of A4 paper and something that ends up 20 meters across. And it's always, and you know that you'll only find out whether it works when it's too late, by the time it's up. And, you know, and hopefully it'll work in ways which you hadn't anticipated. Briefly, most of the work I've made, I guess, in the last 20 odd years has been three-dimensional, but I've always made a lot of drawings, and I always try to look at how these 3D works could be somehow represented graphically. And this is a mock-up sort of wall drawing in the studio of how the Magic Hour piece could be maybe made as wall drawings. And I'm going to be doing these next year as an exhibition, I hope. So drawing is really important to me, but usually it's kind of after the event rather than before the event, or it's just completely independent of the three-dimensional stuff I'm making. And when it's independent of it, it gives you much more freedom just to play around, I guess. And I've always made drawings of fantasy sculptures which are never going to be sculptures. And this is this is a range of drawings from about 1997 to a couple of years ago, which I just displayed as a kind of academy hang, salon hang, in a gallery in the Netherlands. And those drawings, if you look at, there's a kind of green blob on the right-hand side. That was just a bit of paint poured onto a piece of cardboard, which then dried and wrinkled a bit, and then I drew a base underneath it, which I do for all these drawings. And then it becomes a kind of volume. It becomes as if it's like a sculpture of pure colour, which is what I was, disembodied or unsupported colour. At some point a few years ago, I found this dye bond material, which is a composite panel with an white aluminium face, which behaves on a large scale very much like cardboard. It's quite rigid, it's very unabsorbent, and it's sort of flexible but flat. And I thought, well, I can make one of these drawings bigger by pouring it onto this aluminium panel. And as I did that, and this is one of the results, two things. One is that the bigger it gets, the simpler it has to get. I originally made, this is about 2 meters high, and I originally did a rather sort of complicated base for it, like you can see in that green one, this sort of slightly illustrative sort of base. And it just didn't work. On a bigger scale, for some reason, it had to be simpler rather than more complicated, and which is what they become. The other thing they become is paintings, which I never ever thought I'd make a painting. And then when I exhibited them, I realised I'd made a painting exhibition, even though I thought them as big drawings. In my head, they were big drawings. In effect, they're paint on panels, which makes them paintings in my book. I'm going to stop in a minute. And this is just a detail of the base, and the way the paint wrinkles becomes very three-dimensional, very kind of solid. And this is an exhibition of them at Spike Island in Bristol a year or two ago. When I went to art school, I'd gone to art school as a painter, and I never made a painting I was happy with. And I never thought I could. And that's one of the reasons why I ended up making three-dimensional work, using actual materials rather than representing things. So it's something of a surprise to find myself making paintings again. But in a way, the paintings are not that different from, for example, that it's colours on shelves. It's essentially all I do is stick colours on shelves. But I think the thing for me, I think, is that the shelf isolates the colour. It becomes, it's a framing device, and in a way the colour is separate from the shelf. So the colour in a way becomes the subject of the work more emphatically, perhaps. So colours on shelves, which still continues. These are some small concrete works I made. They're the size of a brick. You know, in every back wall in city gardens, people stick glass on them. Well, some people do. to prevent, burglary and so forth. It's kind of a very aggressive form of street decoration. And I just thought, well, that would be, by using coloured glass, I could use that device as a way of generating these transparent, overlapping coloured forms. And these are quite recent 3D works, but again, it's colours on shells, essentially, colours on blocks. And then this is actually my studio quite recently, which is, again, more, these are plexiglass offcuts, or at least they were. Again, the throwaway bits that I stuck into concrete, and then realised I quite enjoyed doing that. So I then had to generate plexiglass offcuts, or perspex offcuts, by going to the acrylic place in London and saying, I want 100 discs of this colour plexiglass, but when you give me them, can you also give me the bit you cut them out from? And then that essentially becomes the work. And so that is almost the last slide. I know there's one person in the audience called Michael. Is there anyone else is anyone called Mike in the audience? Have you ever sent me an email?
No.
So that's not from you then? I just seem, I don't know, that's
So mean.
yeah, isn't it? It's kind of, it's to the point, it's, well, thank you for it not being you, but sometimes you get that kind of stuff. It's kind of, it's the happiest email I've ever received. All right, that's it, thank you. But I'm welcome to take questions if anyone has any. It's true, yeah. I'm sure it does. The relationship between language and the world is an immense one, and a highly complex one. And the curious thing about colour terms is that not every language has colour terms. Not every language has a term for colour at all. I was listening to an Australian Aboriginal artist talk about his work in his own dialect, and when he was asked about colour, he had to use English. They don't have colour terms. And there's a lot of anthropological work on different languages and different colour terms. I'm probably slightly avoiding your question in a way. English didn't used to have colour terms. Middle English has no colour terms. It only has brightness terms. So you'll find terms like gleaming and dull and so forth, but there aren't terms like red, yellow, or blue. And that's in sort of the 15th century. So colour terms are relatively recent part of our vocabulary. And it seems that languages evolve. Languages always changing and evolving. And colour terms evolve at a quite late stage in the development of a language. There's a great, the anthropologists come to this great language called Hanunu, which is a Malayo-Polynesian language. And it has 4 colour terms, which aren't colour terms. 2 of them are dark and light, which is sort of, that's easy enough to make sense of. But the other 2 are fresh and dry. And it's really hard to imagine what that would be like. In fact, it's probably impossible for us. But I think what they're saying is that fresh and dry would be our equivalent of gloss or matte. But we see gloss and matte as qualifiers of a colour term, gloss red or matte red, whereas they see gloss and matte as the key terms, which might be modified by a hue, perhaps, although they don't have the words for hue. So, colour terms in language are very, very unstable. There's overlap. Some people think something's yellow, and other people say it's green. And even different Indo-European languages coordinate the span of the spectrum somewhat differently in terms of the colour terms. So it's a very unstable and vulnerable kind of relationship. And the more unstable it is, the better, I think. I'm not entirely sure that answers your question.
It does, yeah.
Okay.
With the light box installations, are they sort of planned out as in the composition, or is it more of a random process of placing them and moving things about?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. It's sort of suck it and see is the method. It's try, get one box with a certain colour, stick another box on it. Does it look interesting? Does it look unpredictable? And does it sort of hold my attention? If it doesn't, then I don't do it and I look for something else. What I try to avoid is any patterns like red, yellow, blue, primaries and I try to mix up opaque with transparent colours and so on. So I deliberately try to avoid any program or system, and in favour of just trying it out and seeing what seems to work. And I do that with all the. I mean, you're always working with a limited palette when you're using, perspex or cast acrylics or glass. You've only got about 15 or 20 colours you can work with. But if you mix up the sizes and the transparent and opaque, then you generate a kind of range. And you can double them up sometimes and overlay them and things like that. But I really try to avoid, again, the generation who taught me, the minimal and conceptual artists, everything was about systems and laying things out in advance and then executing a system. And I got really sick of that. And there's much more pleasure for me to be had in doing something. It's not random, but it's not planned. And anyway, I think colour, if you do it systematically, you lose a lot of what's interesting about colour, I think.
With regards to writing about whitescapes, just wondering how you sort of deal with exhibiting your artwork in these, really whited out spaces.
Yeah, I mean, in Chromophobia, it's published a long time ago now, I wrote an essay, I wrote a chapter about whiteness and about that mobilisation of white in galleries and particularly in houses and in those sort of architectural environments. And I was pretty sort of sneery about it. But as you're hinting, I think, of course, at the same time, I use those environments all the time. I mostly exhibit the work in relatively white-walled environments. And that's fine, White is great as a backdrop for colour. Black is often better. So yeah, I do use white, and I make white things too. It's not, as a colour, white is great. As a kind of notion of purity and as a sort of fantasy about Western ideals, it's awful. But as a colour, no problems with white at all. And I use white. I've used white plexiglass. I photograph white things sometimes. So that's, it's a colour amongst other colours. It's that elevation of white to a sort of fantasy that I object to, for all its connotations, and be they spiritual or colonial or and so on. But yeah, as a colour, then it's fine. But also a lot of the work I do in not white environments. The works in St Pancras Station or something, or the gallery I work with in Brazil, it's a raw concrete. And actually raw concrete is, if I had a choice, I think that's actually the best environment. I love the sort of intrinsic colour of the material rather than painted colour. And I think it works quite well with the stuff I do. So.
Is that the basis for Luminous and Grey? Luminous and Grey.
Luminous, oh god, there's someone who's read my books. Are you Michael?
Yeah.
No, I thought so. The one person. The more recent book I wrote was called The Luminous and the Grey, and yeah, that is, in a way, well, there's this phrase by Wittgenstein, the great philosopher, who I would have mentioned if I'd had more time, and he says, whatever looks luminous does not look grey. And I just thought that was a marvellous observation. And it's not saying, it's not to do with colour versus non-colour, it's to do with luminosity and absorption, or something that glows and something which absorbs. And concrete is the perfectly absorptive material in that respect. And in a way, the environment of the city, by extension, is the grey against which the luminosity of neon or whatever the lights are, can function. And it's that relationship. And I think actually the luminous and the grey are, they're necessary. They're not opposed in the way that maybe Wittgenstein is. It seems to me that they coexist, and they need each other. The luminous makes the grey look greyer, and the grey makes the luminous look more luminous. And they need each other. It's symbiotic, and and can offer up some fantastic moments.
What's your opinion on Anish Kapoor being given the exclusive rights to Van der Black?
Don't get me started. Not good. Not good is my opinion. I suspect actually that it was Vanta Black. So there's this colour called Vanta Black which has been developed by a company which is meant to be the blackest black paint of all times. And it only, insofar as it only reflects, I think, less than 2% of the light that falls upon it. And the minute I heard about it, I thought, oh yeah, I'll have some of that. Unfortunately, Anish Kapoor got there before me. I suspect it's the company that's saying, yeah, okay, you can use it, but you're not allowed to sell it on. So that sense of him getting exclusive use, I think, might be. I'm trying to be generous. it might be more the company and its sense of it's got an important product than Kapoor himself. If it turns out that it's Kapoor who demanded exclusive use, and I think that's scandalous. But I can't believe an artist would do that. A student of mine wrote to the company who was writing a dissertation on black, and she wrote asking if she could have a sample of Vanta Black, and they were absolutely no. So I think, again, the company's got weirdness about it. If you can get any, let me know.
I have a question.
Oh, good. So
Where do you get your influence? Where do you get your influence from? You neon colours.
Sorry,
where do you get your influence from your neon colours? You seem to have it's sort of like an obsession in a way. Do you have like the obsession of influence of neons?
I've not shown any neon work, have I?
I mean like the luminous works,
Yeah,
like.
I do. I have used neon. Neon's great. Neon is like, it's gone like vinyl and film. It's niche product now. There used to be all these. Thank you. Show everyone else. All right, stop now. I mean, neon is it's a great material. It was invented about 100 years ago, and it almost. And the inventor of it thought it would be this great new light for the city. And of course, it was only ever used for advertisements. Why is that? Oh, and that's because actually it glows with colour, but it doesn't actually illuminate the space. So it just it's self-luminous, but it just the line of neon is just an illuminated line. And car companies and beer companies kind of got hold of it. And there used to be loads of companies in London that would make neon signs. Now there's like 2.
Yeah, it's almost like watching those programs like Pimp My Ride when you mention cars.
Yeah, Pimp My Ride.
Hint out.
Pimp My Art, no. One of the neon companies in London that I've worked with sometimes, they're entirely bankrolled by Tracy Emin.
What's his name, Tracy?
Tracy Emin.
Okay.
Have you ever heard of her?
If I see her face, I might recognize
Yeah, well, don't worry. She makes a lot of neon script works, writing in neon, and that basically keeps the whole company going. And it's like film. I use film in my camera, and there used to be all these labs which were open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, and now there's like 2 labs in London, 9 to 5. So, and LEDs have replaced neon, but you cannot get the range of colours or the quality of colour out of LEDs. And I know I sound like an old fart talking about vinyl is so much better than CDs, and I'm sure they're right, although I can't really tell the difference. But yeah, neon it's but again, you've got a limited palette. There's only about 10 colours you can work with. But it's a truly wonderful form of colour and illumination.
Yeah, it brings that excitingness to it, just like mine.
Yeah, exactly.
Previous previously you mentioned that you can't predict like the reflections that you get from light, but to some degree you can manipulate it. Is it something that you've ever tried doing, or is it something that you would? If not, is there any particular reason?
I mean, I guess I manipulate it all the time in a way. I mean, and making those works which face the wall and throw the, you know, that's exploiting reflections, and it's also trying to control them to some extent. But I think there's always that bit that is slightly, you know, it always escapes the system in a way, just as colour escapes language and is richer and more varied. I think for me the reflection is sort of the symbol of that. It's the symbol of colour asserting its independence and not being controlled or contained by language or by line or by an object. So for me, it's a kind of metaphor of a kind of freedom, if you like. But I do, you know, but I do manipulate it, of course, if I can. But even with the St. Pancras transparent colours, you get that spill of colour onto the ground sometimes, and in some weather conditions. So it's out of your control, you know, and it's somehow better when it's out of your control, I think. It's like saying, oh yeah, the world's bigger than I am, and it's cleverer than I am, and it's good to be reminded of that, you know, that, oh yeah, go on.
Has some of this been democratised recently, domestically, by all those LED technologies and all those kind of lights? Is this something you can live with every day, or is this about its rarity and it's kind of exceptional? It's,
I mean, that's a question, obviously. It's, a few times I've been asked to make works in relation, you know, in a shop or in a shopping centre. And that gets quite complicated because you're already dealing with an environment that's using lights and colours to attract the attention, you know, of the punter there, and it's very hard to compete with that. You know, in an environment full of LEDs and colours and, you know, and flashing ones, and then it makes you want to do something completely with Vanta Black. You want to do something which is the opposite of that. And so I guess although I like putting objects back into the world in various ways, it's shops and shop fronts are quite difficult to deal with. So, and you're right. You know, there's all these kind of LED games and toys and things that, you know, have all sorts of colour generation. Well, and, you know, but then the most prominent form of colour in our lives now are the screens of computers and phones, and they're ubiquitous. And, yeah, 10 years ago they sort of didn't exist. So you're always having to adjust to what's out there and how you can use it as well. So, and I've been making some new works which I've not shown using LEDs, which are programmable, so that you can generate much more than just that range of sort of 7 or 8 off the shelf colours with and they're very crude colours, those LEDs, and the white in particular is really unpleasant. But now, you know, you can get a DMX controller, and you can essentially, you know, when you get that spectrum on your Mac, you can plot any colour within that. So it gives an enormous range of possibility. And I'm not, when I talked about neon and how much better than LEDs it was, I don't think it pays to sort of pretend that LEDs don't exist. You know, they have their own qualities, and they can be exploited as well. I don't want to sort of sit there and go, you know, I'll only use neon, and I'll only listen to vinyl, and I'll only use film cameras. You know, life's too short for that, I think.
Okay. Just to say a very big thank you, David Batchelor. Thank you very much for coming.